The mountain did not look like a killer that was part of its power. Before May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens was known not as a machine of destruction, but as one of the most beautiful peaks in the American Northwest. Snow-covered, graceful, nearly symmetrical, it rose above forests, lakes, and valleys with the kind of stillness that makes people trust mountains too easily. It looked complete, finished, ancient in the comfort way landscapes often do, so old that they seem beyond surprise. But inside that beauty, pressure was gathering. Deep beneath the volcano, magma was forcing its way upward. Gas was building. Rock was deforming. The mountain was changing shape from within long before most people could emotionally believe that shape mattered. In the weeks before the eruption, earthquakes rattled the area. Steam explosions punched through the summit. A strange bulge swelled outward on the north flank, growing larger day by day as if the mountain were inhaling and refusing to exhale. Scientists watched, photographers watched, residents watched, loggers, campers, pilots, reporters, and curious visitors all watched. Everyone knew something was happening. Almost no one knew exactly how bad it would become. That uncertainty is one of the reasons the story of Mount St. Helens still feels so haunting. It was not a disaster that arrived from nowhere. It announced itself in tremors, ash, steam, maps, hazard zones, and scientific concern. And yet, even with warning, even with the growing evidence, even with access restrictions and daily reports, the mountain still had one final surprise. Because when it erupted, it did not erupt the way most people imagine volcanoes erupt. It did not simply send ash and fire upward. It tore sideways open. That is what made it terrifying. At 8:32 a.m. on May 18, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck beneath the volcano. The unstable north flank, already grows quickly, swollen by magma pressing from inside, gave way in a massive landslide. In an instant, part of the mountain collapsed outward. The pressure that had been confined inside the volcano was suddenly released, and what followed was not merely an eruption. It was a horizontal explosion, a lateral blast of superheated gas, ash, rock, and pulverized force shot northward across the landscape at extraordinary speed. Forests did not burn in place. They were flattened. Trees snapped, stripped, and laid down in the same direction as if the mountain had slapped the earth with a single overwhelming hand. Snow and ice melted. Rivers filled with mud and debris. Ash climbed into the sky and drifted across states. Daylight dimmed. Roads vanished. Bridges were destroyed. Entire valleys changed shape. The summit itself was transformed. More than 1,000 feet of the mountain disappeared. A perfect cone became a broken crater. A landmark became a wound. And the people caught near it had almost no chance at all. That is why Mount St. Helens remains one of the most unforgettable natural disasters in American history. Not because it killed on the same scale as the deadliest disasters in the world, it did not, but because it showed something almost psychologically unbearable, that a mountain can look serene while becoming a weapon. That warning can exist without full comprehension, and that landscapes we treat as scenery are often only waiting for the moment when the earth decides to move through them again. Mount St. Helens erupted on May 18, 1980 in the state of Washington, in the Cascade Range of the Pacific Northwest. The eruption killed 57 people, devastated forests, destroyed roads and bridges, triggered massive landslides and mud flows, and permanently altered one of the most recognizable mountains in the United States. It remains one of the most significant volcano disasters in modern American history. The eruption was not only violent, it was scientifically extraordinary. Unlike the classic image of a volcano erupting straight upward like a fountain of fire, Mount St. Helens first failed literally. A huge section of the mountain's north flank collapsed, releasing a catastrophic sideways blast that tore across the surrounding landscape. That blast was followed by vertical eruption, pyroclastic flows, ash columns, and lahars, fast-moving volcanic mud flows that surged down river valleys carrying ash, water, trees, and debris. The destruction spread far beyond the summit. Forests were flattened across vast areas. Ash fell across multiple states. Entire watersheds were altered. Transportation routes were broken. Communities downstream were thrown into crisis. And beyond the physical destruction, the eruption changed how Americans and volcanologists understood volcanic hazards. Because Mount St. Helens was not only an isolated geological event, it was a lesson in how volcanoes build pressure, a lesson in how difficult prediction can be, a lesson in the difference between knowing danger is coming and knowing its exact form. And perhaps most hauntingly, it was a lesson in how beauty can conceal violence for far longer than the human mind is comfortable admitting. Before 1980, Mount St. Helens was often called the Fuji of America. That nickname tells you a great deal about how people saw it. Symmetrical, elegant, snow-capped, a mountain that seemed almost artistically complete. It rose above the forests of southwestern Washington with the kind of visual perfection that encourages people to treat it as an emblem rather than a process. To many, it was less a volcano than a landmark, and a beloved peak, a destination for climbers, campers, sightseers, pilots, and photographers. Its danger existed, but mostly in the abstract. That abstraction is common in volcanic landscapes. If a volcano has not erupted in living memory, or if its unrest belongs mostly to scientific history rather than personal memory, the human mind gradually edits out the danger. The mountain becomes backdrop. It becomes identity. It becomes scenery. People continue living, logging, camping, driving, building, and traveling beneath it because stillness repeated long enough begins to look like permanence. But Mount St. Helens were part of the Cascade volcanic arc, and that meant its calm was never the same thing as safety. The Cascade Range exists because an oceanic plate is being forced beneath the North American plate. That subduction process generates magma, which feeds a chain of volcanoes stretching through the Pacific Northwest. Mount St. Helens was therefore not an isolated anomaly. It belonged to a system of active volcanism shaped by tectonic forces operating far beneath the surface. And Mount St. Helens itself had erupted before. Long before 1980, it had a history of explosive behavior. Layers of ash and geological evidence made it clear that the mountain was not dormant in the permanent sense. It had entered long quiet intervals before and then returned to violence. But geologic timescales are difficult for public memory. If an event lies outside living experience, it becomes intellectually real but emotionally distant. That began to change in March 1980. On March 20, a significant earthquake struck the area, followed by a swarm of smaller quakes. These were the first clear signals that something beneath the mountain had become unstable. Then came steam-driven explosions. Ash vented from the summit. The volcano had entered a period of unrest. And unrest changes the emotional atmosphere around a mountain very quickly. At first, the event created fascination as much as fear. People wanted to see it. News crews arrived. Scientists intensified monitoring. Tourists and curious onlookers gathered where they could. Pilots flew overhead. Photographers waited for dramatic shots. The mountain had become not only hazard, but a spectacle. This mix of science, curiosity, and risk could become one of the defining features of the pre-eruption weeks. Because while the volcano was clearly active, the exact outcome remained uncertain. Volcanoes do not always proceed in clean, predictable patterns. Some unrest ends without catastrophic eruption. Some escalate slowly. Some changes style. Scientists could observe earthquakes, gas, heat, deformation, and surface activity, but translating those signs into an exact forecast remained difficult. This uncertainty mattered not only scientifically but socially. Hazard zones had to be drawn, assessed restrictions had to be justified. People had to decide whether to obey them. Residents, loggers, and local officials had to balance danger against work, property, and skepticism. Then came one of the strangest and most important visible signs of all, the North Plank bulge. As magma rose and pressurized the mountain, the north side of Mount St. Helens began swelling outward. It did not happen invisibly over centuries. It happened on a human timescale. The plank moved outward by measurable amounts each day, creating a grotesque protrusion that was not merely a curiosity, but evidence that the mountain's structure was being forced beyond stability. This bulge changed the nature of the danger. It suggested that the mountain was not just building toward a typical summit eruption. It suggested structural failure. The volcano was being deformed from inside in a way that could not continue forever. The mountain was no longer only restless, it was mechanically compromised, and still life and activity continued around it. Hazard zones were established and access was restricted in many areas, but enforcement was not perfect, and not everyone stayed away. Some were there for work, some were there for science, some were there because they did not fully believe the danger or believed they could read it better than authorities, or believed the mountain would erupt in some other way at some other time. That is another reason the story feels tragic. The warning existed, but warning is not certainty. And certainty is often what people demand before changing their behavior enough to save themselves. In the days before May 18, Mount St. Helens was therefore a mountain suspended between states. It was still beautiful, still visibly a mountain people loved, but it was also full of pressure, earthquakes, unstable rock, steam explosions, scientific anxiety, media attention, and the swelling sign that something beneath the surface was preparing to tear the whole landscape apart. The forest below it remained green. Rivers still flowed. Roads still ran. The morning sky still looked clear. And that is part of what makes the eruption so haunting. The pre-disaster world was not apocalyptic. It was uneasy. The mountain did not announce the exact form of its violence. It only told everyone willing to listen that it was changing fast. Volcanoes are not simply holes in the ground full of fire. They are pressure systems. To understand Mount St. Helens, you have to understand how magma, gas, rock strength, and structural failure interact. Deep beneath the volcano, magma was rising upward. Magma is molten rock, but it is not only molten rock. It also contains dissolved gases, water vapor, carbon dioxide, sulfur compounds, and others. As magma rises toward the surface, pressure decreases. When pressure drops, gases can begin to come out of solution, forming bubbles and dramatically increasing explosive potential. That is one of the key reasons some volcanic eruptions are so violent. Gas-rich magma behaves differently from magma that can release pressure more gently. At Mount St. Helens in 1980, magma intruded into the mountain in a way that deformed the north flank outward. That bulge was not just a surface or deep oddity. It was a visible symptom of internal pressure. The mountain was being forced outward by magma pushing from below and within, effectively inflating part of the volcano into an unstable shape. So the problem was already twofold. Pressure was building, and the structure holding that pressure was weakening. Then came the earthquake on May 18. The earthquake did not create the danger from nothing. It triggered the failure of a system that had already been prepared to fail. The north flank, swollen and unstable, collapsed in what became the largest landslide in recorded history at that time. Huge volumes of rock and ice raced downslope. And that is where Mount St. Helens became scientifically extraordinary. When the flank collapsed, it removed the confining pressure on the gas-rich magma and hot interior beneath. That sudden loss of pressure caused a violent decompression, like uncorking a bottle under impossible force. But instead of releasing upward first, the energy blasted laterally through the newly opened side of the mountain. This lateral blast was catastrophic. It surged northward at tremendous speed, carrying superheated gases, ash, and rock fragments across the landscape. Forests did not merely burn, they were flattened and stripped by a high-speed lateral shock of heat and force. That is why the blast zone looked so shocking afterward. Trees laid down in radial patterns across vast areas, all pointing away from the mountain as if the volcano had punched the forest flat. After the lateral blast, the eruption column rose vertically, sending ash high into the atmosphere. Pyroclastic flows followed, fast-moving currents of hot gas, ash, and volcanic fragments that raced across the landscape with extraordinary destructive potential. These flows are among the deadliest volcanic phenomena on Earth because they combine heat, speed, and suffocating material into one lethal system. Then there were lahars. Lahars are volcanic mud flows or debris flows composed of water, ash, rock, sediment, and other material. At Mount St. Helens, snow and ice melted rapidly from the heat of the eruption, and massive amounts of loose volcanic material mixed with water and surged down river valleys. These lahars carried logs, ash, and sediment long distances, destroying bridges, roads, and river channels far from the volcano itself. That is one of the most important lessons of volcanic science. The summit is not the whole disaster. Volcanoes kill through multiple linked hazards: blast, ash, pyroclastic flows, landslides, mud flows, river disruption, air quality collapse, structural loading from ash fall, transport breakdown. Mount St. Helens produced all of these in one event. The ash itself had another wide-reaching effect. Fine volcanic ash rose high into the atmosphere and then drifted across large parts of the United States. Ash fall can darken daylight, reduce visibility, clog engines, contaminate machinery, disrupt aviation, collapse roofs under weight, and infiltrate lungs, water systems, and every moving parts of human infrastructure. So scientifically, the eruption was not just a mountain exploding. It was a chain reaction. Magma intrusion created deformation. Deformation created instability. Earthquakes triggered collapse. Collapse triggered decompression. Decompression triggered lateral blast. And that blast fed into vertical eruption. Pyroclastic flows, layers, and regional ashfall. What makes the event so memorable is not only that each of these hazards is dangerous, it is that they arrived together. Mount St. Helens was not a single eruption, it was a whole system of destructive processes released in sequence after the mountain failed in exactly the wrong place. On the morning of May 18, 1980, the volcano was already unstable. The north flank bulge remained under tension. Monitoring had shown ongoing unrest. The mountain had been signaling danger for weeks, yet the exact morning of total failure still carried the eerie, ordinary quiet that many disasters do. Forests stood, roads existed, aircraft flew, people watched from distances they believed might still be safe enough. Then at 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck beneath Mount St. Helens. That was the trigger. The already unstable north flank collapsed outward in a giant landslide. It was not a mere slope failure, it was an enormous structural release, and for a few moments the mountain was literally falling apart before it fully erupted. Then came the lateral blast. This is the moment that makes Mount St. Helens unforgettable. Instead of exploding neatly upward like a simplified textbook volcano, the mountain fired outward through the collapsed north face. A wave of superheated gas, ash, and rock blasted across the landscape at tremendous speed. Everything in the immediate blast zone was devastated almost instantly. Forests were flattened, trees were snapped, stripped, uprooted, and laid down in the same general direction. Wildlife was obliterated. People in the direct path had little or no chance. Then the eruption column rose. Ash shot high into the sky, creating a plume visible across enormous distances. Pyroclastic flows surged. The summit was dramatically reduced. More than 1,300 feet of elevation was lost from the mountain. The peak people had known was physically removed. Daylight began to fail in areas affected by ash fall. Ash drifted eastward, darkening skies and coating towns, roads, cars, homes, and crops. In some places, midday became dim enough to feel like early night. Engines failed. Visibility dropped. Breathing became dangerous. Ash does not behave like ordinary dust. It is abrasive, pervasive, and destructive to both lungs and machinery. Meanwhile, the layers were moving. As the eruption melted snow and ice and mobilized enormous volumes of volcanic debris, mud flows surged down valleys and river systems, bridges were destroyed, roads vanished, sediment and logs filled channels. Communities far from the summit faced a different kind of shock, not direct blast, but moving walls of mud and debris generated by the eruption above. The first terrifying phase of the event was over very quickly, but the wider disaster kept unfolding outward through ash, rivers, transport system, and communications. That is what made the timeline so complex. At the mountain, violence was nearly instantaneous. Across the region, consequences expanded by the hour. The most haunting visual evidence came afterward. The blast zone, helicopter footage, and photographs revealed miles upon miles of flattened forest, not burned standing, not selectively damaged, flattened. The landscape looked as if some giant invisible force had passed over it and forced the world to lie down. The mountain itself was transformed into a broken crater. Rivers were choked with ash and debris. Roads ended in emptiness. The familiar geometry of the region had been interrupted. And for the people close enough to see it happen, the event was not remembered as a simple eruption. It was remembered as a landscape-changing category in seconds. One of the most famous names associated with the eruption is David A. Johnston, the volcanologist stationed at an observation post north of the mountain. Moments after the eruption began, he radioed the now historic message, Vancouver, Vancouver, this is it. It was one of the final confirmations that the mountain had entered full catastrophic failure. He did not survive. His words have remained in public memory because they capture something chillingly precise. The moment scientific expectation becomes irreversible reality. There were also workers and residents caught within or near the danger zones who never had a realistic chance once the lateral blast began. Some had remained because of work, some because of property, some because the mountain had already spent weeks in unrest without yet delivering its final violence. This is the difficulty of hazard behavior. Once people acclimate to danger signals that do not immediately become catastrophe, they can begin treating them as background rather than urgency. A logger farther from the direct blast survived because terrain and distance spared him just enough. He later described hearing a sound unlike anything he had known, beyond thunder, beyond machinery, beyond storm. When he looked toward the mountain, the forest itself seemed to be moving, not because the trees were alive, but because they were being flattened in sequence by a force racing toward him. A resident or camper outside the core blast zone could survive the eruption physically and still emerge into a world that no longer looked geographically trustworthy. Roads disappeared under ash or debris. Familiar landmarks vanished. Air turned ash into breath. Daylight dimmed. The catastrophe was not merely visible. It entered the lungs, the eyes, the engine, the road, and the river. These stories matter because Mount St. Helens is easy to remember in diagrams and before and after images. But disasters are never just diagrams. They are the instant when observation becomes fear, the moment when a scientist realizes the hazard has exceeded theory. The second when a worker understands the sound in the distance is not weather. The instant when a mountain you thought you knew becomes something faster, hotter, and more absolute than any human judgment beneath it. The aftermath of Mount St. Helens spread through both landscape and memory. Physically, the mountain was transformed. The summit was gone. A crater faced north, where a near symmetrical peak has once stood. Vast forest areas were flattened, scorched, or buried. Rivers were clogged with ash, sediment, and timber. Layers had reworked value systems. Roads and bridges were destroyed. Reservoirs and waterways were disrupted. The ecosystem was not merely damaged, it had been reconfigured. Ash fall carried the disaster far beyond the mountain itself. Communities across multiple states dealt with darkened skies, respiratory irritation, transportation problems, crop damage, machinery failure, and cleanup efforts that seemed almost endless. Volcanic ash infiltrates everything. It settled into cars, vents, roofs, soil, and lungs. Even far from the mountain, people experienced the eruption not as distant news, but as a substance physically falling into their lives. There was also a scientific aftermath. Mount St. Helens became one of the most intensely studied volcanic events in modern history. The eruption transformed volcanology in practical ways because it provided direct evidence of how plank collapse, lateral blast, uh, pyroclastic processes, and layers could interact in a major eruption. It sharpened hazard science, it improved monitoring strategies, it changed how scientists thought about unstable volcanic edifices and lateral explosions. Then there was ecological aftermath. This is one of the less immediate but most profound parts of the story. The blast zone became a living laboratory for ecological recovery. Scientists watched as landscapes once thought destroyed beyond near-term biological use slowly began supporting life again. Plants returned, animals reappeared, sediment stabilized in places, succession unfolded. The mountain that had demonstrated sudden annihilation also became a place to study slow resilience. But resilience should not romanticize destruction. The eruption killed 57 people. It shattered livelihoods. It destroyed property, roads, forests, and economic systems. It turned a beloved mountain into a reminder that geological beauty is often simply a hazard seen during its quiet years. Mount St. Helens taught a hard lesson. Warning is not the same as understanding. The mountain gave signs, earthquake increased, steam explosion occurred, the north flank broke visibly, hazard zones were drawn. Scientists raised concerns. The event was not hidden, and yet the eruption still killed because science do not eliminate uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly where human beings make fatal decisions. Some stayed too close, some trusted familiarity, some believed the mountain would erupt differently later or less violently. And perhaps that is the real psychological power of Mount St. Helens. It reveals how difficult it is for people to emotionally accept that a beautiful place can become a lethal machine before their eyes. The eruption also showed that volcanoes are never just summit events. They are systems of linked exhausts, collapse, blast, pyroclastic flows, ashfall, river disruption, mud flows, ecological destruction. Each part of the event can kill differently and at different distances. That lesson changed hazard planning not only for Mount St. Helens, but for volcanoes worldwide. But beyond science, the mountain left something more haunting behind. It left a changed image. Before 1980, Mount St. Helens was widely remembered as a perfect cone. Afterward, it became a broken crater. That visual transformation matters because it made the event impossible to forget. The mountain itself became a scar visible from the sky, a geological memory that refused to let the region return psychologically to the old illusion of permanence. And maybe that is the final lesson. Mountains look eternal, but their timescale is longer than ours. But they are not still, not really. They gather pressure in silence. They deform without asking whether people are ready to believe it. They wait longer than human attention can easily endure. And then, when the balance fails, they can remake the world in a single morning. Mount St. Helens was not terrifying because it erupted. Volcanoes erupt. It was terrifying because it exploded sideways through a landscape that still believed the mountain was the only scenery. And on May 18, 1980, that scenery answered back with ash, heat, force, and the sudden revelation that beauty in the natural world is often only calm under pressure.